Imagine standing at the edge of an ancient forest, somewhere in what we now call Central Europe, roughly 8,000 years ago. The air is cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. Massive oaks stretch their arms across a sky that has barely changed since the last ice retreated northward. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf calls out. Not in warning, but in the casual, ancient rhythm of a world that has known only wildness for as long as memory stretches back. You watch as a small group of people move silently through the undergrowth. They carry spears tipped with carefully knapped flint. Their clothing is made of stitched animal hides. Their eyes are sharp, scanning every trembling leaf, every broken branch. These are not primitive people. They are extraordinarily skilled, deeply intelligent, intimately connected to every pulse and pattern of the living world around them. They know this forest the way we know our own homes. Every trail, every watering hole, every seasonal rhythm. They have lived this way for thousands upon thousands of years, and they have no idea that everything is about to change. This is the story of one of the most profound transformations in the history of the human species. It is not a story of conquest told in the thunder of armies. It is not a story that unfolded in a single dramatic moment. It is a slow story, a quiet story in many ways. The kind of story that reshapes a continent not through sudden violence alone, but through the patient, accumulating weight of generations living, farming, building, and moving across the land. It is the story of the Anatolian farmers, a people who emerged from the ancient highlands and river valleys of what is now modern Turkey, and whose westward migration across Europe thousands of years ago would fundamentally alter the genetic, cultural, and demographic story of an entire continent. It is, in a very real sense, a story about where the ancestors of many modern Europeans actually came from. And the answer is far older, far stranger, and far more remarkable than most people ever imagine. But before we can understand where these farmers came from and what they brought with them, we first need to understand the world they were walking into. We need to go back, much further back, and meet the people who were already there. Europe, in the deep prehistoric past, was not the tamed and cultivated landscape we recognize today. Picture instead a continent almost entirely blanketed by ancient forest. From the rocky coastlines of what would one day be Portugal to the marshy river deltas at the edge of the Black Sea, trees dominated everything. Dense, cathedral-like forests of oak, elm, lime, and hazel stretched across the lowlands. Higher elevations were crowded with pine and birch. Rivers ran wild and unchecked, flooding their banks each spring, carving new channels through soft soil, creating vast wetlands teeming with waterfowl, beaver, and fish. The megafauna of an earlier epoch, the woolly mammoth, the cave lion, the giant Irish elk, had largely disappeared by this point, retreating into extinction as the planet warmed at the end of the last glacial maximum. But the land was still extraordinarily abundant with life. Red deer moved through the forest in great herds. Aurochs, the massive, dangerous wild ancestors of modern cattle, grazed in forest clearings. Wild boar rooted through the leaf litter. Rivers ran silver with salmon and trout. The seas around Europe's long coastlines offered shellfish, seals, and an astonishing variety of marine life. Into this world of abundance, the hunter-gatherers of prehistoric Europe had adapted with breathtaking sophistication. These were the descendants of people who had survived the brutal cold of the last ice age, who had watched glaciers advance and retreat across their world, who had hunted species now entirely extinct, and who had developed rich and complex cultures long before farming ever entered the picture. Archaeologists give them various names depending on their region and time period. The Mesolithic peoples of Europe, the Western hunter-gatherers, the Eastern hunter-gatherers. But behind these dry academic labels are real human communities with intricate social structures, spiritual lives, and technological traditions refined over tens of thousands of years. Their toolkit was remarkable. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers crafted tiny, precisely shaped flint blades called microliths. Small enough to fit on a fingertip, but sharp enough to cut through sinew, skin, and wood with ease. These could be hafted into arrows, spears, and composite tools of extraordinary efficiency. They wove baskets and nets from plant fibers. They built boats capable of navigating rivers and coastlines. They constructed shelters from wood and hide that could be assembled and dismantled with practiced ease. They understood the medicinal properties of plants, the behavioral patterns of prey animals across seasons, and the navigational stars above them. Some communities, particularly those living along coastlines and major rivers where food resources were especially concentrated, built semi-permanent settlements and accumulated enough food surplus to support larger social gatherings. At sites like the famous Lepenski Vir in what is now Serbia, hunter-gatherers built sophisticated trapezoidal houses and created striking stone sculptures, evidence of a rich symbolic and artistic life that challenges any simplistic idea of prehistoric people as purely nomadic wanderers with no attachment to place. These people were also, the genetic evidence now tells us, physically distinct in ways that might surprise us. Ancient DNA analysis, a field that has exploded with new discoveries over the past 2 decades, has revealed that the Western hunter-gatherers of Europe typically carried genetic variants associated with dark skin, blue or light-colored eyes, and dark hair. They were not the pale-skinned, light-haired populations we often associate with Northern and Western Europe today. The genetics of skin color, it turns out, have a much more complex and recent history on this continent than anyone previously suspected. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. That part of the story comes later. For now, understand that when we speak of prehistoric Europe before the arrival of farming, we are speaking of a world that had been shaped entirely by the hunting and gathering way of life for an extraordinarily long time. These communities were mobile or semi-mobile. Their populations were spread relatively thinly across the landscape, because a given area of forest and river can only support a limited number of people living from wild resources. Population densities were low by later standards. Estimates vary, but some researchers suggest that all of Mesolithic Europe may have been home to only a few 100,000 people at most. The land was vast, the forests were deep, and the people who lived within them had reached a kind of equilibrium with their world that had persisted, in its essential form, for thousands of years. And then something began to stir far to the southeast, something that would, slowly and inexorably, change everything. If you wanted to find the birthplace of European agriculture, the original source of the Great Transformation, you would need to travel to a region that sits at the intersection of Europe and Asia, at the edge of the ancient Near East. You would need to go to Anatolia. This is the large peninsula of land that forms the Asian portion of what is today Turkey, bounded by the Black Sea to the north, the Aegean to the west, and the Mediterranean to the south. It is a land of dramatic contrasts, volcanic plateaus and fertile river valleys, rugged mountain ranges and sheltered coastal plains. And it sits at the edge of a larger region that archaeologists and historians have long called the Fertile Crescent, the broad arc of agriculturally productive land sweeping from the Levant through Mesopotamia that has sometimes been called the cradle of civilization. It was here, in the highlands and valleys of Anatolia and the broader Near East, that one of the most consequential experiments in human history was quietly unfolding. For thousands of years before the period that concerns us most, the peoples of this region had been gradually, incrementally developing a new relationship with the plants and animals around them. This was not a planned revolution. No ancient genius sat down one day and invented farming from scratch. The process was far more gradual and organic than that. A slow accumulation of knowledge, habit, and circumstance spread across many generations. People noticed that certain wild grasses produced larger, more nutritious seeds in disturbed soil near their camps. They began to encourage these plants, clearing competing vegetation, perhaps replanting seeds from the most productive specimens. Over generations, many generations, this casual encouragement became deliberate cultivation. Wild wheat and barley, the ancestors of the cereal crops that would eventually feed billions of people, began their long journey toward domestication. The same slow transformation was happening with animals. Wild sheep and goats were common in the highlands of Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains. Hunter-gatherers had hunted them for millennia, but somewhere along the way, the genetic evidence now places early sheep and goat domestication at roughly 10,000 to 11,000 years before the present. Human communities began managing these animals rather than simply hunting them, keeping young animals alive, selecting for docility over generations, gradually shaping wild creatures into the domestic livestock we recognize today. Cattle followed, pigs followed. A new kind of economy was being born. The site of Çatalhöyük, in south-central Anatolia, gives us a vivid glimpse into what early agricultural society looked like during this transformative period. This remarkable settlement, occupied from roughly 7,500 to 5,700 BCE, was home at its peak to several thousand people living in densely packed mud brick houses with no streets between them. Residents entered their homes through holes in the roof, climbing down on wooden ladders. The walls of these houses were decorated with elaborate paintings, reliefs of wild animals, and strange symbolic imagery. Skulls of aurochs were mounted on walls. The dead were buried beneath the floors of the living. Çatalhöyük was a world unto itself, a dense, complex, socially stratified community that would have been utterly alien to the hunter-gatherers of contemporary Europe. It was a place where people lived in close, permanent proximity to one another, where food was grown and stored rather than hunted and gathered, where the rhythms of the agricultural calendar, planting, tending, harvesting, storing, organized daily life in ways that were fundamentally different from anything that had come before. If you are finding this story as fascinating as we do, this is a great moment to hit that subscribe button and join our community. We explore stories like this every week, going deep into the ancient world to understand the extraordinary journey of the human species. Now, back to Anatolia. The transition to agriculture was not uniformly smooth or beneficial, it should be said. Early farmers were in many ways less healthy than their hunter-gatherer predecessors. Studies of ancient skeletal remains reveal that people who adopted farming suffered more dental cavities, more nutritional deficiencies, more infectious diseases, and shorter average stature than those living from wild food resources. When you eat a diverse wild diet of game, fish, nuts, berries, roots, and tubers, you obtain a remarkable breadth of nutrients. When you begin to depend heavily on wheat and barley, you are eating a narrower, carbohydrate-heavy diet that can leave certain nutritional gaps. Moreover, living in close proximity to domesticated animals, sharing your space with cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, creates ideal conditions for the transmission of animal diseases to humans. Many of the most devastating infectious diseases in human history, from smallpox to influenza, have their roots in the domestication of animals and the dense living conditions of early agricultural villages. 2. And yet, despite these health costs, agriculture spread. It spread because it offered something that hunting and gathering, for all its dietary advantages, could not match at the population level: the ability to produce far more food per unit of land. A given acre of cultivated wheat fields could support dramatically more people than the same acre of wild forest. Agriculture allowed populations to grow in ways that the Mesolithic way of life simply could not sustain. More food meant more births surviving to adulthood, more people to till more fields to feed more people. Once the agricultural feedback loop began, it was extraordinarily difficult to stop. Farming communities grew, villages expanded, and as populations grew beyond what the local landscape could support, something inevitable happened. People began to move. This is the moment the story turns westward. This is where the farmers of Anatolia begin their long journey into Europe. The migration was not a sudden event. It was not an invasion in the military sense, not a coordinated campaign of conquest. It was something slower and stranger and more complex, a demographic diffusion, a gradual spilling of agricultural populations across new landscapes. unfolding over not years or decades, but centuries and millennia. The ancient DNA evidence, pieced together from thousands of skeletal samples recovered from prehistoric sites across Europe and the Near East, now allows us to trace this movement with remarkable precision. And what the genetics reveal is a story of extraordinary reach and persistence. The Anatolian farmers who began moving into Europe around 7,000 to 6,500 BCE were genetically distinct from the hunter-gatherer populations they were encountering. They carried different variants in genes affecting skin pigmentation, metabolism, disease resistance, and other physiological traits. In their genetic ancestry, they bore the signatures of a long period of residence in the Near Eastern agricultural heartland, ancestry that connects them to the populations of Anatolia and, more distantly, to the broader ancient Near East. When ancient DNA researchers compare the genomes of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers from sites across Europe with those of the earliest Neolithic farming communities found in the same regions just a few thousand years later, they find something dramatic. The farming communities show overwhelming Anatolian ancestry. In many early Neolithic sites in Central and Western Europe, the hunter-gatherer genetic signal almost disappears, replaced by genetics that point unmistakably back to Anatolia. This tells us something profound. The spread of agriculture in Europe was not, in the first instance, primarily a case of local hunter-gatherers learning new techniques from their neighbors and adopting farming while staying in place. It was, to a very significant degree, a demographic replacement, or more precisely, a demographic swamping. The Anatolian farmers moved into Europe in numbers large enough to overwhelm and absorb the existing hunter-gatherer populations in many regions. They brought their crops, their animals, their pottery, their mud brick architecture, their symbolic traditions, and their genes. And they spread all of these things across a continent that had previously known none of them. Picture the arrival of these first farming communities on the European side of the Aegean, pushing up through Thrace and into the Balkans. They would have encountered landscapes not entirely unlike the ones they had left behind in western Anatolia. Rolling hills, river valleys, patches of woodland and open grassland. These were landscapes that an experienced farmer could read, could evaluate for soil quality and water availability and shelter from wind. They would have begun clearing small areas of forest using polished stone axes, a Neolithic innovation that was far more efficient for felling trees than anything available to Mesolithic toolmakers. They would have broken the soil with digging sticks and simple wooden ards, the forerunners of the plow. They would have planted their emmer wheat and ean corn, their lentils and peas, and watched the first European harvests grow from Anatolian seed. Pause for a moment and imagine what this looked like from the perspective of the hunter-gatherers who were already living in these landscapes. They would have seen, arriving on their horizon, communities of people who were unlike anything they had previously encountered. People who lived in permanent or semi-permanent structures. People who kept strange, docile versions of wild animals penned in enclosures. People who carried ceramic vessels, pottery, an invention entirely unknown to Mesolithic Europeans, and stored grain in quantities that would have seemed extraordinary to those accustomed to living from day to day on what the forest provided. The two groups spoke different languages, practiced different rituals, organized their social lives along different principles. The encounter between these two ways of being human must have been one of the most consequential cross-cultural meetings in prehistoric history. What happened when they met? This is one of the most fascinating and debated questions in the entire field of prehistoric archaeology, and the evidence paints a nuanced picture. In some regions and at some times, there appears to have been significant intermingling. Hunter-gatherers adopted elements of farming culture or joined farming communities, and left genetic traces in the local Neolithic population. At some sites, archaeologists find evidence of what looks like trade or exchange between farming and foraging communities. Neolithic pottery and Mesolithic flint tools found in the same archaeological layers, suggesting contact and interaction rather than complete separation. There are even sites that appear to represent transitional communities, groups experimenting with a mixed economy of some cultivation alongside continued hunting and gathering. But the overall genetic pattern across Europe is clear. Over the long run, the Anatolian farming populations grew far more rapidly than the hunter-gatherer populations, and their genetic contribution to later European populations massively outweighs that of the original Mesolithic inhabitants. The sheer reproductive advantage of agriculture, the ability to feed more children and raise more of them to adulthood, ultimately tilted the demographic scales decisively. In region after region, as farming spread and farming populations grew, the hunter-gatherer genetic signal fades. Some populations of hunter-gatherers, particularly those in areas less suited to early agriculture, dense northern forests, high mountain valleys, remote coastal areas, may have maintained their traditional lifestyles for considerably longer, perhaps by thousands of years in some cases. But the direction of the overall trend was unmistakable and irreversible. The farming frontier moved, over the course of roughly 2,000 years, from the Balkans through Central Europe, up the Danube and Rhine River valleys, across the low-S plains of what is now Hungary and Austria and Germany and the Netherlands, and eventually reached the Atlantic coast of Europe and the British Isles. This is one of the most remarkable demographic movements in prehistoric history, a migration that ultimately carried the genes, the culture, and the agricultural way of life of Anatolian farming communities to the far edge of the European continent. We can trace the archaeology of this expansion in remarkable detail. One of the most important cultural complexes associated with the early spread of farming into Central Europe is what archaeologists call the linear band ceramic culture, or LBK, named for its distinctive pottery decorated with incised linear bands. LBK farming communities appear in the archaeological record of Central Europe around 5,500 BCE and spread with astonishing speed along the river valleys of Central Europe, from Hungary to the Paris Basin in just a few centuries. These communities built distinctive long houses, massive timber-framed rectangular buildings that could reach 30 or 40 meters in length, and that housed extended family groups along with their animals and stored grain. The LBK peoples settled preferentially on the productive low-S soils of river valleys, clearing forest, tilling the land, raising their cattle and pigs and sheep, and living in village communities of perhaps 100 to several hundred people. If you have been enjoying this journey through deep prehistory, now would be a wonderful time to leave a like on the video. It genuinely helps us reach more people who love exploring these ancient stories, and it only takes a second. Now let us keep going because the story is about to get even more fascinating. The genetics of LBK communities have been extensively studied, and the results are clear. These Central European early farmers carry the unmistakable genetic signature of Anatolian ancestry. When researchers compare their genomes to those of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who lived in the same regions just before the LBK horizon appears, the difference is stark. The LBK farmers are not the descendants of local hunter-gatherers who adopted agriculture. They are, in their primary ancestry, migrants or the close descendants of migrants from southeastern Europe and ultimately from Anatolia. The agricultural transformation of Central Europe was carried out largely by people who came from somewhere else, bringing a new way of life with them. This does not mean the hunter-gatherers simply vanished. As mentioned, the genetic record shows traces of hunter-gatherer ancestry persisting in early Neolithic European populations, evidence that some degree of intermarriage and cultural exchange was taking place. But the ratios are telling. In many early Neolithic European populations, the hunter-gatherer genetic contribution is small, sometimes only a few % of the total ancestry. The Anatolian farming ancestry dominates. What we are seeing, played out in ancient DNA across hundreds of archaeological sites, is a demographic transformation of enormous scale. Think for a moment about what this means for our understanding of the deep roots of European populations. For much of the 20th century, the prevailing academic view was that the spread of agriculture in Europe was primarily what researchers called a cultural diffusion. The idea that farming spread as a set of ideas and techniques, passed from community to community, adopted by local hunter-gatherers who continued to farm the land their ancestors had always roamed. Under this model, the fundamental population of Europe had remained essentially continuous since the late Paleolithic, with the same people, the descendants of the original modern human settlers of Europe, simply adopting new technologies over time. This was a comforting and in many ways plausible-seeming story. The ancient DNA revolution has overturned it. The evidence now accumulated from thousands of ancient genomes collected from sites across Europe and the Near East tells a fundamentally different story. The major population of Europe today is not primarily descended from the Paleolithic and Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who inhabited the continent before farming arrived. Instead, the majority of the ancestry of most Europeans traces back to two major later migrations. First, the Anatolian farming migration we have been describing, which transformed European genetics during the Neolithic. And second, a later migration from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian, by peoples associated with the so-called Yamnaya culture, which reshaped European populations again during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. The Paleolithic and Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Europe, those extraordinary people who painted the walls of Lascaux and Altamira, who survived the ice ages and hunted mammoths across frozen tundra, who built elaborate communities along ancient rivers. They are present in the ancestry of modern Europeans, but as a minority contribution. The majority story is one of later migrations, of new people arriving and, through the simple arithmetic of reproduction across many generations, coming to demographically dominate the continent. The Anatolian farming migration is the first and in many ways the most foundational of these demographic transformations. These were the people who first brought the package of Neolithic innovations to Europe: agriculture, animal husbandry, pottery, polished stone technology, permanent settlement. And in doing so, they laid the demographic and cultural foundations on which all subsequent European prehistory would be built. Their arrival in Europe set in motion a cascade of changes that would ultimately let us slow down for a moment and think about what the daily life of these migrating Anatolian farming communities might have looked like as they spread through Europe. In a newly established farming village on the Los Plains of what is now central Germany or northern France, the rhythms of life would have been governed by the agricultural calendar in ways entirely foreign to the hunter-gatherers of earlier generations. Spring meant the critical work of planting, breaking the soil, sowing the grain, praying to whatever deities the community recognized for rain and sun in the right proportions. Summer meant weeding and tending, watching the crops, protecting them from deer and boar who would happily devour a season's work in a single night. Autumn brought the harvest, an enormous communal effort to gather and thresh and store the grain before the cold came. Winter was the season of relative rest, of craft work and storytelling, of maintaining tools and repairing structures, of the social and ritual life of the community. The houses these communities built were monuments to permanence. Unlike the shelters of mobile hunter-gatherers, designed to be erected and abandoned as the community moved through its seasonal range, Neolithic longhouses were built to last. Their massive timber frames required felling large trees and shaping them into posts and beams, work that demanded organized collective labor and planning. The clay and timber walls, the thatched roofs, the storage pits dug into the ground beneath the floor. All of this represented an investment of labor that only made sense if you intended to stay in one place for years, perhaps for generations. The house itself became a symbol of rootedness, of the community's commitment to a particular piece of land. And this relationship with land was itself something new. Hunter-gatherers moved through the landscape, reading it and using it, but not, in any permanent sense, owning or transforming it. Farmers planted orchards, they dug wells, they cleared forest and replaced it with fields, they built fences and enclosures. Over years and decades, they physically shaped the landscape around their villages, creating a humanized environment that would persist long after any individual generation had passed. The landscape itself became a kind of accumulated labor. a repository of generations of work, in a way that it never had been under the hunting and gathering economy. This relationship between farming communities and the land they transformed is one of the deepest roots of concepts of property, territory, and belonging that would eventually become central to all later European societies. The spread of farming also brought a dramatic increase in population density. As noted earlier, the same area of land that could support perhaps 1 or 2 hunter-gatherers per square kilometer could support many times that number of farmers. As farming villages multiplied and expanded across Europe over the course of the Neolithic, the total human population of the continent grew substantially. More people meant more complexity, more need for social organization, for systems of storage and redistribution, for mechanisms of conflict resolution, for specialists who could focus on particular crafts rather than the generalist survival skills of hunter-gatherers. The seeds of social stratification, of leadership hierarchies, of increasingly complex religious and ritual systems, all of these were being planted along with the wheat and barley. The pottery of these early European farming communities is another window into the richness of their cultural life. Ceramic technology, the ability to shape clay into vessels and fire them to hardness, was unknown in Europe before the arrival of the Anatolian farmers. With its introduction came an entirely new material culture: pots for cooking, for storing grain and liquids, for ritual use, for burial with the dead. Early Neolithic pottery in Europe is often decorated with elaborate geometric patterns, and the styles of decoration varied by region and time period, allowing archaeologists to trace cultural connections and divergences across the continent. The same clay that was shaped into storage jars was also shaped into figurines, small representations of human figures, often female, found across dozens of Neolithic sites from the Balkans to Western Europe. These figurines, many of which seem to represent female forms with exaggerated physical features, have long fascinated archaeologists as evidence of Neolithic religious or ritual life, though their precise meaning remains a matter of ongoing debate. We should also talk about the megalithic tradition, one of the most visually stunning legacies of Neolithic Europe. Beginning in the 5th millennium BCE and continuing into the 3rd, farming communities across Western Europe began constructing massive monuments from stone. The great dolmens and passage tombs of Ireland, Brittany, and Iberia, the long barrows of Britain and Scandinavia, and ultimately the astonishing stone circles, of which Stonehenge is only the most famous example. These were not the work of a mysterious, vanished civilization, as some popular accounts have suggested. They were built by the farming descendants of Anatolian migrants, communities that had, over generations, become fully European in their cultural expression, but whose genetic ancestry still carried the deep signature of that original agricultural migration from the East. The megalithic builders were capable of extraordinary feats of engineering, organizing the quarrying, transport, and erection of stones weighing tens or even hundreds of tons. Their monuments were expressions of a complex religious and cosmological worldview, often oriented toward astronomical events like the winter solstice sunrise, speaking to sophisticated knowledge of celestial cycles developed over many generations of observation. This is a wonderful place to remind you. If you want to see where the story goes from here, from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age and the arrival of the steppe peoples who brought yet another wave of transformation to Europe, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the next chapter in this extraordinary human journey. But let us return to the core of today's story, the Anatolian farmers themselves, and what the science of ancient DNA has done to our understanding of their legacy. The ancient DNA revolution in archaeology has been genuinely transformative, one of those rare moments when a new scientific tool arrives and fundamentally changes what we thought we knew about the past. The ability to extract and sequence DNA from ancient skeletal remains, teeth, petrous bones from the inner ear, and other well-preserved tissues, and to compare those ancient genomes to one another and to modern populations, has opened a window into prehistoric population history that previous generations of archaeologists could only dream of. In the past decade and a half, teams led by researchers including David Reich at Harvard, Johannes Krause, and Wolfgang Hack at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and many others have published studies analyzing thousands of ancient genomes from sites across Europe, the Near East, and Central Asia. The picture that has emerged from this enormous body of work is complex in its details, but clear in its broad outline. For Europe specifically, the ancient DNA evidence has confirmed and dramatically enriched the story we have been telling here. The Anatolian Neolithic farmers who spread into Europe from approximately 7000 BCE onward were a genetically coherent population whose ancestry can be traced back to the early farming communities of Anatolia and, more broadly, the ancient Near East. They are genetically distinct from both the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers they encountered in Europe and from the later steppe populations who would arrive in the Bronze Age. In region after region, when researchers look at the earliest Neolithic farming communities, they find overwhelmingly Anatolian-related ancestry. And in region after region, when they look at the preceding Mesolithic populations, they find the very different genetic profile of the Western hunter-gatherers. The meeting of these two genetically distinct populations, the incoming Anatolian farmers and the resident European hunter-gatherers,
archaeological record. What is beyond doubt is the scale and significance of what happened. The migration of Anatolian farmers into Europe represents one of the largest and most consequential demographic movements in the history of the continent. A transformation that unfolded over millennia, but that cumulatively altered the genetic composition of Europe more profoundly than almost any subsequent event until the much later demographic changes of the historical period. The hunter-gatherers who had inhabited Europe for tens of thousands of years did not simply disappear. Their genetic legacy persists in every modern European to some degree. But they were demographically overwhelmed by the arrival of a new population carrying a new economy. The continent was transformed, root and branch, by the quiet revolution of farming and by the extraordinary journey of the people who brought it. Stand again at the edge of that ancient European forest. But now imagine the scene 8,000 years after our opening moment. The forest is still there, but it is interrupted now, broken by clearings where rectangular fields of grain sway in the summer wind, where smoke rises from the thatched roofs of longhouses, where children chase chickens in the mud between storage pits, where old women grind grain between heavy stones, and old men repair the wooden handles of polished stone axes. The hunter-gatherers who once moved silently through these trees have not entirely vanished. Here and there, in the deep forests and along remote coastlines, communities still live by the old ways, still track red deer through the undergrowth, still fish the rivers with woven nets. But they are diminishing. The arithmetic of population growth is inexorable. The fields are producing children faster than the forest can. Something immense has happened here. Something that began not in Europe at all, but in the highlands of Anatolia, in the early farming villages of the ancient Near East, in the long, slow process by which our ancestors learned to coax food from domesticated plants and animals, and then carried that knowledge and those crops and those animals and themselves across the face of the earth. The story of the Anatolian farmers is not just the story of a migration. It is the story of a transformation in the very relationship between the human species and the living world. A transformation so fundamental, so far-reaching in its consequences, that we are still living with its effects today, every time we eat bread or drink milk or walk through a cultivated field. The people who made that transformation possible were extraordinary in ways we are only beginning to fully appreciate. They were adventurous enough to move into unknown lands. They were resilient enough to establish communities in alien environments. They were adaptive enough to modify their farming practices to suit new soils and new climates. And they were human enough to meet and mix, and sometimes conflict, with the people they found already living there, leaving in the genetic record of their descendants the traces of every encounter, every marriage, every generation that followed. Their story is our story, the deep, tangled, endlessly fascinating story of how the human species made itself at home on this planet, one generation at a time. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the ancient world. If this story moved you, or surprised you, or made you think differently about where we come from, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who loves history. It genuinely makes a difference in helping us continue making content like this. And subscribe if you have not already, because the story is far from over. The Bronze Age migrations, the rise of the Indo-European languages, the steppe peoples who brought yet another transformation to Europe. All of that is waiting for you in the next chapter. The ancient world has so many more secrets to reveal. We will see you there.